There is a particular kind of silence that lives between dying stars. Not the absence of sound, which space has always been, but the absence of hope. The system's Commonwealth had known that silence for 300 years. It had settled into the bones of every world that remembered the old golden age, into the hollow stations where treaty flags still hung in airlocks. No diplomat had walked through in generations, into the long dark between the galaxies, where the spirit of the abyss moved like a tide that had no shore. Dylan Hunt had spent the better part of a decade pushing back against that silence. He had rebuilt the Commonwealth world by world, signature by signature, argument by argument, and occasionally at gunpoint. The restored Commonwealth was real now, fragile as new ice over deep water, but real. Worlds had rejoined. Fleets had reformed. The High Guard flew again. But the abyss was not finished. It was never finished. 300 light years from the Commonwealth's newly re-established capital, in a region of space where slipstream currents ran old and strange, entangled like rivers approaching a falls, something happened that had no entry in any Commonwealth navigational database, no precedent in veteran astronomical records, and no explanation in the collective memory of every AI system Dylan Hunt had ever consulted. The slipstream convulsed. It did not collapse. It did not branch into new corridors the way it sometimes did near massive gravitational anomalies. It convulsed, a full-spectrum shudder that rolled through every open slipstream aperture within 6 systems and sent every FTL-capable vessel in the region lurching out of transit with their pilots shaking and their instruments screaming. On 17 different ships, navigators looked at their readouts, looked at each other, and had no words. At the center of the convulsion, something emerged. It came through trailing fire and impossible geometry, a vessel that moved like it was still fighting through water rather than vacuum, its hull plating the color of ancient iron, its silhouette built on principles of hydrodynamics that made no sense in the void, and yet carried somehow a sense of absolute defiant purpose. It was enormous by any measure, but not in the sleek, predatory way of a Nietzschean dreadnought or the cold mathematical efficiency of a Commonwealth heavy cruiser. It was enormous the way a cathedral is enormous, built to carry something larger than its physical dimensions, shaped by the hands of people who understood that the things worth protecting required vessels worthy of the journey. On its bow, in characters no Commonwealth linguistic database could immediately parse, was a name, Daihe Yamato. Inside the ship, alarms were screaming. Captain Juso Okita stood at the center of the bridge with the particular stillness of a man who has already made peace with the worst the universe can offer and has simply decided to keep working anyway. He was not a young man, and the illness that had been slowly dimming his light since before the voyage began had not paused for the crisis. But his eyes moved across the devastated instrument panels with the calm precision of a commander who knew that panic was the one luxury he could not afford, not with 999 souls aboard, and Earth dying behind them at the rate of 1 year of habitability per day. Shima. His voice was quiet. It always was. Daisuke Shima, his hands already moving across the helm controls with the focused urgency of a man trying to re-establish order from chaos, responded without looking up. Hull integrity holding. Wave motion engine is stable. Whatever that was, didn't touch the engine core. A pause. Captain, our navigational fix is gone. I cannot find Iskander. I cannot find the Magellanic Cloud. I cannot find... Another pause, a longer this time, weighted with something that was trying very hard not to become fear. I cannot find the sun. Susumu Kodai was already at the tactical station, his young face tight with controlled urgency. Sensors are rebuilding. Give me 90 seconds. He worked in silence for a moment, then, Captain, the star configurations do not match any chart in our database. Any of them. We are not in our galaxy. The bridge held its breath. Okita looked at the forward viewport, where an unfamiliar star field burned with cold, indifferent beauty, and said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then, Yuki, damage report. Kodai, I want a full sensor sweep. Friend, foe, or debris. I want to know everything within 10 million kilometers. Dr. Sado, he touched his communications panel. Prepare sickbay for precautionary intake. Ash Analyzer. The ship's mechanical companion unit rolled forward with a characteristic beep. Captain Okita, preliminary astronomical analysis suggests we have been displaced across an interdimensional or interuniversal boundary. The stellar cartography does not match any known configuration in our database or in any database I have access to. This is a rare pause from the machine. Unprecedented. Yes, said Okita simply. It is. He turned back to the viewport. Somewhere behind them, behind the light years and the dimensional breach and whatever the slipstream had done to them, Earth was dying. The Gamellas were still bombarding it. Every hour they spent lost in an unknown universe was an hour the planet they had sworn to save bled a little more. He felt that weight the way he felt the illness in his chest, as a constant, non-negotiable reality to be managed, not surrendered to. We will find our way back, he said, and it was not a promise made to lift morale. It was a statement of intent from a man who had already decided. But first we survive where we are. Kodai, what do you see? Kodai looked up from his sensors, and something shifted in his expression. Not fear, something closer to wonder, threaded through with the particular wariness of a warrior who has learned that wonderful things in space are frequently also dangerous things. Captain, he said, there's a ship out there, and it's coming toward us fast. If you want to see more ships and crews enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a ship, crew, or character, and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. The Andromeda Ascendant had seen many things in her long operational life, longer than most ships ever achieved, courtesy of the 3 centuries she had spent frozen at the event horizon of a black hole while the universe aged around her without her consent. She had seen Nietzschean fleets and Magog swarms and the cold geometric horror of abyss-corrupted vessels that moved like nightmares given mass and velocity. Her AI, in both her ship form and her android avatar, had processed combat scenarios of virtually every configuration the known galaxies could produce, and several they had no right to. She had never seen anything like this. Rami! Dylan Hunt leaned forward in the command chair, his forearms on his knees, his eyes fixed on the forward display with the focused attention he reserved for situations that were either very interesting or very dangerous, and this appeared to be both. Tell me what I'm looking at. The holographic avatar of the Andromeda Ascendant's AI materialized at his left, her dark eyes already moving across data streams that only she could read at the speed she was processing them. Unknown vessel. Configuration matches no recorded design in Commonwealth, Nietzschean, Vedran, Calderan, or collector's databases. Hull composition is primarily iron and titanium alloy, with trace exotic elements I cannot immediately identify. So propulsion appears to be reaction-based, conventional by Commonwealth standards, but there is an energy source aboard that is anything but conventional. A slight pause that, on a human, would have indicated genuine uncertainty. Dylan, the energy signature from their primary drive system doesn't match anything in my records. Not even close. It's not antimatter. It's not gravity lens. It's not slipstream adjacent. It's something I have never encountered, and I have encountered a great deal. Weapons? Multiple energy weapon batteries, torpedo launchers, point defense systems, all currently powered down or in standby configuration. They're not targeting us. Another pause. They appear to be running damage control. Whatever came through that slipstream convulsion with them, it shook them hard. From the helm, Hibika Valentine was already running her own assessment with the practiced eye of a woman who had spent most of her adult life making rapid judgments about unknown vessels in terms of whether they were worth approaching or worth running from. Her raid was immediate and practical. Ship that size coming out of that kind of transit event, running damage control and not powering weapons. They're hurt and they're confused. They're not an attack formation. She glanced at Dylan. Doesn't mean they're not dangerous. Everything's dangerous, Dylan said, which was less a philosophical observation than a statement of operational fact aboard the Andromeda Ascendant. He stood. Hail them. All frequencies, all linguistic databases, machine translation running. Already trying, Romy said. Their communications array is active. They're transmitting. but the language doesn't match any Commonwealth standard or any of the 412 languages in my primary database. A beat. Running deep pattern analysis, the linguistic structure is human-derived. Old. Very old in terms of language evolution. I'm getting partial matches to an extinct Earth language family, specifically a branch of East Asian linguistic heritage that Commonwealth records classify as a pre-expansion tongue called Japanese. The bridge absorbed this in a moment of collective recalibration. "They're human," said Trans-Gemini from her station, and there was something in her voice that was not surprise. Trance rarely sounded surprised, which was one of the many things about her that Dylan had learned to pay attention to. And the golden-skinned avatar of a sun said it the way someone confirms something they already knew, with the particular quiet of a person setting down a weight they have been carrying for some time. "They're human, and they're very far from home, and they've been trying so hard." Dylan looked at her for precisely the length of time it took him to register that she knew something she wasn't yet sharing, which was her way, and then he filed it and moved forward because the vessel on his screen was real and present and required immediate decisions. "Trance. Later." He turned back to the display. "Rami, can you construct a working translation matrix from the pattern analysis? Give me 4 minutes and I'll have something functional. It won't be elegant. Elegant is for diplomats. Yeah, we just need workable." Dylan moved toward the forward viewport, studying the unknown ship's silhouette. It was built like something that had known gravity once, like something that had lifted from the surface of a world and carried that memory in its bones. The design language was ancient by Commonwealth standards, rooted in an aesthetic of purpose rather than efficiency, and yet there was nothing primitive about the energy readings Rami was still processing from its core. "What's the crew complement?" "Biosigns suggest approximately 1,000 human life forms, all human baseline. No genetic modifications I can detect. No cybernetic integration beyond minimal mechanical prosthetics on a handful of individuals." Romi's expression shifted fractionally. "Dylan, several of the life signs are registering significant physiological stress markers that are not consistent with combat trauma or the transit event. Long-term stress, chronic." A pause waited with something that on her passed for concern. "Some of them appear to be ill, seriously ill." Dylan was quiet for a moment, watching the iron ship hold its position with the careful stillness of a vessel whose crew was watching him back just as intently. 1,000 humans, hurt, lost, carrying an energy source that shouldn't exist, coming out of a slipstream convulsion in a region of space where slipstream did not behave like this without reason. In Dylan Hunt's experience, things that arrive without reason during the final stages of a war against cosmic evil were either the worst thing possible or exactly what was needed. And the line between those two outcomes was usually very thin and almost always dependent on what happened in the next few minutes. "Romy," he said, "the moment that translation matrix is ready, open a channel. Translation matrix ready in 90 seconds. Then let's go meet our guests." At her station, Trans-Gemini said nothing. She simply looked at the iron ship on the screen with ancient golden eyes, and the expression on her face was one that Dylan Hunt could not read. Somewhere between relief and the particular sorrow of someone who understands exactly what a thing is going to cost before it begins. The translation matrix Rami constructed was imperfect in the way that all bridges between distant languages are imperfect. It carried meaning across the gap but lost texture, nuance, or the particular weight that certain words hold in the mouths of the people who grew up with them. What it could not translate, it approximated. What it could not approximate, it left as silence. But silence, Dylan Hunt had learned, was itself a form of communication, and the silences in the exchange that followed told him as much as the words. Captain Okita appeared on the forward display like something out of an old painting. A man whose face had been shaped by decades of command into something that no longer needed to perform authority because it had simply become it. He was seated, which Dylan noted immediately, not because it was unusual for a captain to be seated on his own bridge, but because of the quality of the stillness. It was not the stillness of ease. It was the stillness of a man conserving something. His eyes were sharp and present and missing nothing, but there were shadows beneath them that had nothing to do with the lighting aboard his vessel. Behind him, a younger man stood at tactical, Dark-haired, intense, with the controlled urgency of someone who had already calculated 3 responses to every possible answer Dylan might give, and was waiting to deploy whichever one the situation demanded. This one, Dylan thought, was going to be interesting. "Captain Okita," Dylan said, and watched the slight delay as Rami's matrix processed and delivered his words in something approximating the man's language. "I'm Captain Dylan Hunt of the system's Commonwealth vessel, Andromeda Ascendant. You have entered Commonwealth space under unusual circumstances. We mean you no harm. Can you tell me your situation?" The delay on Okita's end was longer. His translation was running in reverse, reconstructing Dylan's words from Romi's matrix approximation. When he spoke, his voice was exactly what his face had promised. Measured, quiet, carrying the weight of someone who had decided that honesty was the most efficient tool available. "Captain Hunt, I am Juzo Okita, commanding the Earth Defense Forces vessel Yamato. Our situation is—" a fractional pause. A man selecting words with the precision of someone who cannot afford imprecision. "Complicated. We were on a mission of critical importance to our planet's survival when a spatial anomaly displaced us from our course. We do not know where we are. We do not know how to return, and we do not have unlimited time." "Your planet's survival," Dylan repeated. "Hey, Earth is dying," Okita said, with the flat directness of someone who has long since passed through grief and out the other side into pure operational focus. "We have a finite window in which to complete our mission and return with what we need to save it. Every hour we spend lost in your space is an hour we cannot afford." Dylan absorbed this. Behind him, he was aware of Baca's expression shifting. She had grown up in the hard margins of the Commonwealth's collapse, in the spaces where nobody came to save you, and the particular note in Okita's voice was one she recognized from her own history. Trance had gone very still. "We'll do everything we can to help you find your way home," Dylan said, and meant it completely. "But first I need to understand what I'm dealing with. At that energy source your ship is running, our sensors have never encountered anything like it. What can you tell me about it?" It was the young man at Tactical who answered, stepping forward with the kind of confidence that was not arrogance, but competence expressing itself cleanly. "I'm Susumu Kodai, Tactical Officer. The engine is called a wave motion engine. It draws on energy from the fabric of space itself, what we call wave motion energy. It powers everything aboard the Yamato, including our primary weapon." "Your primary weapon," Rami said from beside Dylan, and her avatar's eyes were very focused. "We detected an energy buildup consistent with a weapon system when you first emerged from the transit anomaly. Our analysis suggests that weapon, if fully discharged, would be significant." "It would be," Kodai said, and Ronan did not elaborate, which told Dylan everything he needed to know about the weapon scale. There followed a silence of the productive kind, both sides calculating, both sides honest about the calculation. It was Baca who moved things forward, because Baca Valentine had a navigator's instinct for when a conversation needed someone to change course before it stalled. She leaned into the channel with the easy directness that was her particular gift. "Look, you're lost. Your planet is on a clock, and you've got a ship full of people who just got thrown across whatever that anomaly was. We've got the best navigational database in 3 galaxies, and a slipstream pilot who can go places most ships can't. We'll help each other. It's not complicated." Okita looked at her for a moment with what appeared to be genuine appreciation for the simplicity of her framing. Then he looked back at Dylan, and the assessment in his eyes was the assessment of one commander taking the measure of another across a language barrier in a dimensional breach. Reading character rather than words. "Your offer is generous, Captain Hunt," he said, "but I must be direct with you. We will accept your help, and we will offer what assistance we can in return. But the Yamato serves Earth. Our mission does not change. If the path home requires us to leave without completing whatever obligations your situation might ask of us, then you leave," Dylan said simply. "Your people come first. I understand that better than you might think." Something shifted very slightly in Okita's expression. The fractional relaxation of a man who has just confirmed something he had hoped was true but needed to verify. He nodded once, with the weight of a formal agreement. At her station, Transgemini watched the exchange with her golden eyes and felt beneath the relief she had carried since the Yamato emerged from the slipstream's convulsion, the first cold touch of what was coming. She knew what the spirit of the abyss had felt the moment the wave motion engine crossed into this universe. She had felt its attention shift like a vast tide changing direction. It had noticed, and now it was thinking. The Nietzscheans had a saying that predated the Commonwealth's fall by at least 2 centuries, one of those philosophical fragments that had survived the collapse because it was useful rather than beautiful. The universe does not reward hesitation, it rewards the prepared. Charlemagne Bolivar, pride alpha of the Bolivar Nietzschean, pride and commander of the dreadnought Eternal Supremacy, had built his entire career on that principle. He had survived the wars of the Commonwealth's restoration by being precisely calibrated in his assessments, knowing which fights to take, which alliances to hold long enough to extract value from, and which opportunities appeared only once and destroyed those who failed to grasp them. When his sensors had detected the slipstream convulsion 3 hours ago, he had noted it and waited. When his long-range arrays had resolved the unknown vessel's configuration and begun analyzing its energy signature, he had stopped waiting and started planning. The wave motion engine read like nothing in any database his ship's AI could access, which was itself significant information. Nietzschean intelligence networks were among the most comprehensive in the known galaxies. The product of 3 centuries of survival in the hard spaces between Commonwealth order and abyss-touched chaos. If something fell outside those networks, it was either trivial or transformative. The energy readings from the iron ship were unambiguously the latter. A power source of that magnitude, exotic enough to evade categorization, carried by a vessel whose crew appeared to be unaugmented baseline humans on a mission desperate enough to push them across dimensional boundaries? The calculus was not complicated. "They've made contact with Hunt," said his second, a lean woman named Serafina, whose bone blades were the finest the Believer Pride had produced in a generation, and whose tactical mind was, in Charlemagne's assessment, almost worthy of her genetics. "The Andromeda has been alongside the unknown vessel for 40 minutes. Translation protocols established." "Hunt will offer them everything," Charlemagne said without contempt. It was simply an accurate prediction of Dylan Hunt's behavioral pattern, which was as consistent as a physical law. Resources, navigation, protection. He'll want them as Commonwealth allies. He'll see the ship as a symbol. He paused, watching the long-range sensor feed with calm attention. He won't see it as a weapon. That is the difference between Hunt and us. "You want the engine?" Serafina said. "I want what the engine represents. A power source outside the abyss's comprehension. Outside any comprehension in this universe. Do you understand what that means in the current strategic situation?" He finally turned from the sensor display to look at her directly. "The Commonwealth has rebuilt itself on hope and Dylan Hunt's considerable stubbornness. But hope doesn't stop the Magog world ship. Hunt's stubbornness doesn't unmake the abyss. What stops an enemy of that magnitude is force it has never encountered and therefore has no defense prepared against." He looked back at the display. "That ship is force the abyss has never encountered. Acquiring it won't be simple. Hunt will defend them." "Hunt will defend them as allies," Charlemagne agreed, "which means we don't approach as enemies." He allowed himself a slight smile that carried no warmth whatsoever. "Next, we approach as interested parties, with an offer." Aboard the Yamato, the offer arrived with the particular timing that Kodai had learned to distrust. Too soon after first contact, too precisely calibrated to the gaps in their situation. The Nietzschean vessel had emerged from a slipstream point 40,000 kilometers off their port bow, its transponder broadcasting on Commonwealth standard frequencies with a courtesy that felt like a weapon being held behind a back. Dylan Hunt's voice came through the Yamato's communication channel with a sharpness that had not been present in their earlier exchange. "Captain Okita, the vessel that just appeared in your sensor range is Nietzschean. I'd recommend not accepting any communication from them without—" The Nietzschean channel opened anyway. Because Kodai had already flagged it, and because Captain Okita believed that information was always preferable to its absence, regardless of the source. Charlemagne Bolivar appeared on the secondary display with the composed elegance of a man who had rehearsed this moment and was now delivering it as a performance. He was striking in the way that all Nietzscheans were striking, built beyond baseline human parameters, carrying himself with the absolute physical confidence of someone who had never seriously doubted his own body's capabilities. The bone blades curving from his forearms were visible and unretracted, which Kodai recognized immediately as a display rather than a threat. Visible power as negotiating posture. "Captain Okita," he said, his translation coming through Romi's matrix with a smoothness that suggested the eternal supremacy had been running its own linguistic analysis in parallel. "I won't waste your time with pleasantries. I know what you need. A path home, and whatever resources are required to complete your mission. I know what you have, an energy source and a weapon that this universe has never seen. I represent a faction with the navigational knowledge, the military reach, and the strategic interest to offer you both of the former in exchange for access to the latter." He paused with the precision of someone who has calculated exactly how long a pause should last for maximum effect. "Captain Hunt is an idealist. He will help you because it is right. I will help you because it is useful. In my experience, usefulness tends to be more reliable than righteousness." Okita listened to this without expression. When Charlemagne finished, the captain was quiet for a measured moment, and Kodai watched him with the attention he always paid to Okita's silences, because the captain's silences were where his decisions lived before they became words. "Your offer is noted," Okita said finally. "I will consider it." He closed the channel. Dylan Hunt's voice returned immediately, with the careful tone of a man controlling his response. "Captain Okita." "Captain Hunt," Okita said, with a gentleness that was also absolute. "I said I would consider it. I did not say I would accept it, but I will not close any door until I understand what is behind it." A pause. "You told me your people come first, and I ask that you extend the same understanding to my methods." The channel held a silence that was, this time, Dylan Hunt recalibrating. "Fair enough," he said at last, "but watch your back. Nietzscheans don't offer things. They invest in them." Kodai looked at the sensor display, where the eternal supremacy held its position with patient geometric precision, and then at the star field beyond it, strange and beautiful and threaded through with dangers he was only beginning to map. He had a feeling Dylan Hunt was right. He also had a feeling that before this was over, they would need every door they had left open. The spirit of the abyss did not think the way living things thought. It did not plan in the sense that commanders plan, assembling resources and contingencies in linear sequence toward a defined objective. It was older than that. And it was older than the Commonwealth, older than the veterans who had founded it, older than the civilizations that had risen and fallen in the three galaxies. Like foam on a tide, it had been generating since before most of those civilizations had learned to look up at the stars and wonder. It thought the way deep water thinks, in pressures and currents, in the patient redistribution of mass across vast distances, in the certainty that everything above it would eventually sink. But it could be surprised. The wave motion energy that had crossed into its universe through the slipstream convulsion was not something it had anticipated, and the spirit of the abyss responded to the unanticipated the way all ancient predators respond to the unfamiliar, with immediate, total, consuming attention. It had spent 3 centuries dismantling the system's Commonwealth. It had worked through the Magog, through corrupted veterans, through the careful seeding of despair into every alliance Dylan Hunt had tried to rebuild. It had felt the Commonwealth's restoration with the particular irritation of a force that does not experience setbacks often enough to be practiced at accepting them. Hunt had been an annoyance, a persistent, infuriating, cosmically unlikely annoyance who kept refusing to behave according to the mathematics of civilizational collapse. But the wave motion engine was something different. The abyss had spent eons learning the energy signatures of this universe. It knew slipstream. It knew antimatter. It knew the emotional spectrum that the veterans had mapped and the exotic particles that the collectors had cataloged. It knew the shape of every power source in 3 galaxies, the way a predator knows the scent of every animal in its territory. Knowledge was control, and control was the only form of existence the abyss recognized as meaningful. The wave motion energy had no shape it recognized. It could not be consumed. It could not be corrupted. It existed outside the abyss's taxonomy of power, and that meant it existed outside the abyss's control. And that was intolerable in a way that transcended strategy and became something closer to instinct. It sent the Magog, the first indication aboard the Yamato that something had changed in the strategic situation, came from Analyzer, whose sensor integration ran continuous passive sweeps as a background function even during the diplomatic exchanges of the past several hours. The mechanical unit rolled to Kodai's station with a rapid series of alert tones that the tactical officer had learned to read as urgency expressed in machine language. Kodai, Analyzer said, I am detecting a mass emergence event at the edge of sensor range. Multiple contacts, very multiple contacts. Kodai looked at the readout and felt the particular cold clarity that combat always brought him, the narrowing of attention to what was real and immediate and required response. How many? My sensor calibration for this universe's vessel types is still incomplete, Analyzer said with the honest precision that was its defining characteristic. But extrapolating from the emergence pattern, several thousand individual units, possibly more. The formation is consistent with what Captain Hunt's crew have described as a Magog swarm configuration. Kodai was already opening the channel to the Andromeda. Captain Hunt, are you seeing this? Dylan's response came with the tight, controlled energy of a man shifting from diplomatic mode to combat mode with practiced efficiency. We see it. That's a Magog advanced swarm. Not the world ship, not yet, but the world ship sends these ahead to assess and weaken. A pause filled with the sound of his bridge responding around him. This is a significant force, larger than standard assessment deployment. They came for us, said Romi's voice, cutting through with the directness of an AI that had already completed the logical chain. The wave motion engine's energy signature crossed into this universe through the slipstream event. The abyss detected something outside its known parameters and responded. This swarm is not a coincidence of timing. Kodai looked across the bridge to Captain Okita, who had listened to the entire exchange from his command position, with the stillness he always maintained when the situation was at its most serious. Their eyes met, and in that exchange passed the wordless communication of a crew that had already survived the impossible together. The acknowledgement that the universe had, once again, decided that their problems were not yet sufficiently complicated. Captain, Kodai said, the wave motion gun is charged to 40%. Full charge requires another 20 minutes. I know, Okita said. On the communication channel, Sir Charlemagne Bolivar's voice entered the conversation with the smooth inevitability of a man who had been monitoring the sensor feeds and waiting for precisely this moment. Captain Okita, Captain Hunt, the Eternal Supremacy carries a full complement of Nietzschean strike fighters and enough firepower to bloody the swarm's leading edge significantly. A perfectly calibrated pause. I would be willing to commit those resources to the defense of this position, in exchange for a conversation about the future, once the immediate situation is resolved. Of course you would, Becca said, with the flat expressiveness of someone who had grown up around exactly this kind of transactional generosity. Dylan's voice came through with the tone of a commander making real-time calculations about unpleasant necessities. Okita, and I won't pretend I'm comfortable with Bolivar's involvement, but right now we need every gun available. The swarm will reach optimal engagement range in 11 minutes. My recommendation is a combined defensive formation, Andromeda and Eternal Supremacy on the forward arc. Yamato positioned at the center with your fighter complement covering your flanks while your primary weapon reaches full charge. Okita considered this for exactly the time it required. Kodai, battle stations. Shima, position us as Captain Hunt recommends. He opened the broad channel. Captain Hunt, we will hold the center. Captain Bolivar, your fighters on our port flank. We will not waste the position you are offering. A pause that carried the weight of a man who had learned that gratitude and wariness were not mutually exclusive. But understand that the Yamato makes its own decisions about when and how its primary weapon is used. That is not a negotiating point. Charlemagne Bolivar's response was, for the first time, something that approached genuine respect. Understood, Captain. The Magog swarm rolled toward them through the dark between stars like a tide that had been building for 300 years. And at the center of the defensive formation, the Yamato turned its ancient iron face toward the oncoming darkness and charged its impossible weapon. And the crew of a dying Earth prepared once again to fight for something larger than themselves. The battle lasted 4 hours and rewrote the tactical understanding of everyone who survived it. The Magog swarm moved with the particular horror that had made it the instrument of civilizational collapse across 3 galaxies. Not the horror of a weapon, which has direction and purpose and can be anticipated, but the horror of a natural disaster that has learned to want things. Individual Magog craft were small, fast, and structurally simple to the point of disposability. Their pilots, such as they were, did not maneuver to preserve themselves. They maneuvered to breach holes, to board, to infest, and the mathematics of the swarm were built on the assumption that enough of them would survive the defensive fire to accomplish exactly that, regardless of how many thousands were destroyed in the approach. Hanon, the Andromeda Ascendant fought with the comprehensive violence of a high-guard warship, finally given a target worthy of her full capabilities. Her point defense grids running at maximum cycle, her AP cannons cycling through targeting solutions at a rate that would have been impossible without Rami's direct integration with every weapon system aboard. Dylan Hunt commanded from the center of it with the particular focus that his crew had come to recognize as his highest operational state. Not the intensity of someone fighting for survival, but the clarity of someone fighting for something specific, something worth the cost being paid in this moment. The Nietzschean strike fighters from the Eternal Supremacy perform with the brutal efficiency that Nietzschean military culture had spent 3 centuries perfecting. And they did not fight beautifully. They fought effectively, which in Charlemagne Bolivar's philosophy was the only aesthetic that mattered. The port flank held, and the Yamato held the center and waited. It was the waiting that cost the most. Kodai stood at his tactical station and watched the swarm's leading edge break against the combined defensive fire and reform, and press forward again with the mindless persistence of something that did not experience attrition as discouragement. And he tracked the wave motion gun's charge percentage with the focused attention of a man who understood that the weapon was both their greatest asset and their greatest vulnerability. That the window between full charge and discharge was the moment when everything depended on everything else holding. 17 Magog craft broke through the defensive perimeter and reached the Yamato's hull. The ship's secondary batteries and the Zero fighters from the flight deck handled most of them. Most. 3 breach attempts reached the outer hull plating before point defense neutralized them, and the impacts rang through the ship with the deep resonant sound of a vessel being tested against its own structural limits. Damage control teams moved with the practiced urgency of a crew that had already survived the Gamila's bombardment of the solar system, already crossed the space between galaxies once before, already learned that the Yamato was not merely a ship, but a commitment made physical. And commitments did not yield to pressure. They absorbed it and held. At 93% charge, Captain Okita made a decision. "Kodai," he said quietly, and across the noise of the battle. "Target the swarm's densest concentration, the central mass formation at bearing 274. Kodai looked at the targeting display and then at Okita. "Captain, at 93%, the dispersion pattern will be wider than optimal. The outer edges of the beam—" "I know," Okita said. "Ensure Captain Hunt and Bolivar are advised to clear the firing corridor. Then fire when ready." The channel to Andromeda opened immediately. "Captain Hunt, we are firing the wave motion gun in 90 seconds. Clear bearing 274 to a depth of 400,000 kilometers. Anything in that corridor?" "Understood," Dylan said, and his voice carried the particular quality of a man who had just been told something that recalibrated his understanding of the word significant. His orders to his own crew followed in rapid sequence, and the Andromeda moved with the immediacy of a ship whose captain trusted his instincts about when to stop asking questions and start moving. The firing corridor cleared. The wave motion gun discharged. What followed existed at the boundary between tactical event and natural phenomenon. The beam that erupted from the Yamato's bow was not the color of any weapon in the Commonwealth's experience, not the blue-white of plasma discharge, or the coherent red of focused laser energy, or the dimensional distortion of a nova bomb's precursor wave. It was the color of something fundamental being redirected, a shade that Romi's optical systems recorded and then spent the next several minutes attempting to categorize without success. It crossed 400,000 kilometers in the time it took Baker Valentine to exhale one breath. The central mass of the Magog swarm ceased to exist, not damaged, not dispersed, not destroyed in the conventional sense of the word, which implies fragments, debris, the residue of things that were. The section of swarm the beam passed through simply was no longer present in the physical universe, and the space it had occupied was temporarily filled with an energy resonance that Romy logged as unlike anything in her considerable experiential database, and the swarm's remaining elements, deprived of their central coordination mass, fractured into the confused retreat behavior that Nietzschean tactical doctrine had spent decades learning to exploit. Charlemagne Bolivar's strike fighters exploited it. And the battle was over in 11 minutes after the discharge. In the silence that followed, the particular silence of a crew that has just survived something and has not yet fully processed the cost of surviving it, Dylan Hunt sat in his command chair and looked at the tactical display for a long time without speaking. Romy stood beside him and also said nothing, because she was still processing the sensor data from the wave motion gun's discharge, and the preliminary results were generating questions she did not yet have frameworks to ask properly. It was Baker who eventually broke the silence, with the directness that was her most consistent quality. "Okay," she said. "I need someone to explain to me what we just watched that ship do." Dylan opened the channel to the Yamato. Captain Okita answered immediately, and as though he had been waiting. He looked, Dylan thought, exactly as he had looked before the battle. The same stillness, the same careful management of whatever the illness was doing to him in the background of every moment. But there was something additional in his expression now, something that Dylan recognized from his own mirror in the hard years of the Commonwealth's rebuilding. The look of a man who has just spent something he cannot replace and is already calculating whether it was worth the price. "Captain Okita," Dylan said, "we owe you a debt, and I think we need to talk about what's coming next, about what that weapon means, and about what this universe may be asking of you before we can send you home." Okita nodded once, with the weight of a man who had already arrived at the same conclusion by a different route. Yes," he said. "I believe we do." The conversation happened in the Andromeda Ascendant's main conference room, which Dylan Hunt had always thought of as the place where the Commonwealth was rebuilt one difficult truth at a time. The room had seen Nietzschean pride alphas and displaced heads of state and traumatized survivors of Magog attacks, and at least one entity that had been pretending to be human for so long, it had partially forgotten it wasn't. It was a room accustomed to complexity. Captain Okita arrived via a Commonwealth shuttle with Kodai at his side, an analyzer rolling behind them with the cheerful mechanical curiosity of a unit encountering an entirely new technological civilization and finding every moment of it fascinating. Okita moved through the Andromeda's corridors with the careful economy of a man who had made a precise internal agreement about how much energy each action was permitted to cost him. And Dylan, watching him cross the conference room threshold, revised his earlier assessment upward. The captain was not merely ill. He was ill and aware that he was ill and had decided with characteristic precision that this fact was not permitted to be relevant until the mission was complete. Dylan respected that completely and found it deeply concerning in equal measure. Trans-Gemini was already in the conference room when they arrived. She had been there for some time, her sitting with her hands folded on the table and her golden eyes carrying the quality they carried when she was not fully present in the current moment. When some portion of her ancient awareness was distributed across timelines and probabilities that no baseline human perception could access. She looked up when Okita entered, and the expression on her face was the one Dylan had been waiting to address since the Yamato had first appeared on his sensors. "You knew they were coming," Dylan said to her, not as an accusation but as the establishment of a fact that the room needed to contain before anything else could be built on it. "Not coming," Trance said, with the careful precision she used when the distinction mattered. "Arriving. There is a difference. Coming implies intention toward a destination. The Yamato did not intend to be here." She looked at Okita directly, And the look was the look of someone seeing a person whole, past and present and probable future simultaneously, the way only a stellar avatar could. You were brought here because something in the architecture of what needs to happen required you to be here. The slipstream didn't malfunction. It responded. Kodai leaned forward with the focused intensity that Dylan had already identified as his default mode. Responded to what? To the wave motion energy, Trance said, and to what the spirit of the abyss is preparing. She paused, and the pause had the weight of someone deciding how much of a truth to deliver at once. The abyss has spent 3 centuries learning every power source in this universe. Its strategy is built on that knowledge. It corrupts what it understands and destroys what it cannot corrupt. But wave motion energy is outside its comprehension. It cannot model it. It cannot predict it. It cannot build a counter to something it has never encountered. She looked at Okita with the directness of someone who understands that kindness sometimes requires honesty delivered without softening. Your ship is the one variable in this universe's final equation that the abyss did not account for. The silence that followed was the silence of a room absorbing a weight that had just been formally placed on the table. Okita looked at Trance for a long moment with the eyes of a man taking the measure of something he could not fully categorize, an entity that presented as human and was not, speaking with a certainty that was not prediction, but memory of something that had not yet happened. He had encountered the inexplicable before. The wave motion engine itself was inexplicable to most of his own civilization's physics. He had learned that the inexplicable, properly understood, was simply the explicable waiting for the right framework. "What is the abyss preparing?" he asked. Dylan answered, because this was information he had, rather than speculation Trance was offering. The Magog world ship. It's not a vessel in the conventional sense. It's a construct the size of a small solar system, carrying billions of Magog and weapons capable of destroying stars. The abyss uses it as its final instrument when it wants to end something completely. He met Okita's eyes across the table. He and our intelligence suggests it's moving toward the Commonwealth's restored capital. At its current velocity, it reaches optimal engagement range in 14 days. Kodai did the calculation visibly, his expression moving through the mathematics of scale and arriving at a place that was beyond his previous tactical reference points. A construct the size of a solar system, he repeated, not as a question, but as a man making himself say the thing in order to make it real enough to work with. "The wave motion gun," Romy said from the room's integrated speakers, her ship self present in the conversation, even as her avatar stood against the far wall. "Discharged at 93% charge, eliminated approximately 12,000 Magog craft and an undetermined quantity of associated mass in a single firing event. The world ship's total mass is estimated at..." She delivered the figure with the precision of an AI that understood the value of accuracy even when accuracy was staggering. "Several orders of magnitude beyond what the gun eliminated today." "So one shot is insufficient," Kodai said. "One shot at current charge levels is insufficient," Romy said. "The wave motion engine's theoretical maximum output, if the weapon were fired at full charge from optimal range." She paused in the way she paused when her calculations were producing results that surprised even her. "Is more difficult to assess. The energy physics involved are outside my modeling capacity. I cannot put a ceiling on what that weapon does at 100% discharge." Everyone in the room looked at Okita. The captain had been listening to all of it with his characteristic stillness, and now he was quiet for a moment that the room instinctively did not interrupt. When he spoke, his voice carried the quality it always carried when he had moved through all the considerations and arrived at the thing that mattered. "The Yamato was built to save one world," he said. "It carries the hopes of 8 billion people who are dying while we sit in this room." He looked at Dylan with the directness of someone who had earned the right to speak plainly about impossible things. "I will not pretend that I am indifferent to what you have told me. I am not. What the abyss represents, the deliberate extinction of hope, watch the systematic dismantling of everything civilizations build when they choose to reach toward each other rather than destroy each other. This is not a thing a man of conscience can hear about and simply set aside." He paused. "But I must be honest with you about my limits, Captain Hunt. The Yamato has one primary mission. The crew aboard my ship did not sign a contract with your universe. They signed one with Earth. Dylan nodded slowly. I know. I'm not asking you to break that contract. He leaned forward, his forearms on the table, his eyes steady. I'm asking you to consider that the path the slipstream chose for you might lead home through something rather than around it. Trance looked at Okita with her ancient golden eyes and said very quietly, Yeah, the Abyss will not let you leave without a fight regardless of what you decide in this room. It cannot afford to. You represent the one thing it cannot control, and it will spend every resource it has to eliminate that variable before you can carry it back to wherever you came from. She paused. The question is not whether you fight the Abyss, Captain. The question is whether you fight it on your terms or its terms. Okita absorbed this. Beside him, Kodai was very still in the way he was still when he had reached a conclusion and was waiting to see if the captain reached the same one. Outside the conference room's viewport, the stars of an unfamiliar universe burned with cold, patient fire, and somewhere in the deep dark between the galaxies, the Magog world ship turned toward the heart of everything that had been rebuilt from 3 centuries of collapse, and the spirit of the abyss, ancient and vast, and suddenly, for the first time in eons, uncertain, pressed its incomprehensible attention toward the iron ship and the impossible energy burning in its core, and waited to see what a dying captain from another universe would decide to do with the time he had left. Trans-Gemini left the conference room before the formal decisions were made, which was her way. She contributed what she came to contribute and then removed herself from the linear process of implementation, because linear processes were not her native language, and her presence in them tended to complicate rather than clarify. Dylan had learned not to interpret her departures as indifference. She cared more than anyone in the room, in the way that entities who can perceive the full weight of what is at stake care, with a comprehensive, sometimes crushing totality that baseline human emotional architecture was not built to sustain. She went to the observation deck, where the viewport ran the full length of the outer hull and the stars of a universe that was not the Yamatos burned in their unfamiliar configurations, and she stood there and did the things she rarely permitted herself to do in the presence of others. She looked at all of it at once, the timelines, the probabilities, the branching architecture of what could happen and what would happen, and the narrow thread of what needed to happen running through the middle of it like a wire-carrying current through a storm. She had known about the Yamato for longer than she had been on the Andromeda. She had known about it the way she knew about everything that mattered to the universe's survival, not as a prediction, which implies uncertainty, but as a memory of something she had experienced from a direction that baseline beings could not perceive. She had arranged to be in the right place, in the right configuration when it arrived, because that was what she did, and she had waited through the first contact and the Nietzschean posturing and the Magog assault with the patience of something that experiences time as a landscape rather than a current. But patience did not mean absence of cost. She had felt the abyss's attention shift when the wave motion gun discharged, shot him, and the quality of that shift had told her something that she was not yet ready to share with Dylan, because sharing it would change the decisions being made in the conference room in ways that needed to remain unmade for slightly longer. The Abyss was not merely moving the world ship toward the Commonwealth's capital, it was moving it toward the Yamato. The agreement that emerged from the conference room was the kind that only forms between people who have run out of the luxury of disagreement, not comfortable, not complete, but functional in the way that things built under pressure are functional. Okita had listened to Dylan's full strategic assessment of the world ship's approach vector, its estimated combat capabilities, and the Commonwealth's available response options with the attention of a commander integrating tactical data in real time. He had asked 3 questions, each of them precise, each of them going directly to the load-bearing elements of the plan rather than its surface. Dylan had answered them honestly, including the answer to the third one, which was that without the wave motion gun, the Commonwealth's combined fleet had a calculated 17% probability of stopping the world ship before it reached the capital. 17%. Kodai had looked at that number with the expression of a man who had grown up on Earth during the Gamlis bombardment, who had watched the planet's surface become uninhabitable degree by degree, to who understood in his bones what it meant when the mathematics of survival reduced to single digits. and then looked past the number to the people it represented, the worlds it represented, the 3 centuries of rebuilding and loss and stubborn, improbable hope that it represented, and something in him had settled into a resolve that was quieter and deeper than anger. Okita had made his decision in the manner that all his decisions were made, without announcement, without drama, with the simple, clean movement of a man who has completed his consideration and is ready to act. "We will need to know everything about the world ship's structure," he had said, "every analysis your sensors have produced, every tactical assessment your AI can generate. And the wave motion gun is not a precision instrument at extreme range. To be effective against a target of that magnitude, I need to understand its architecture well enough to identify the points where a single discharge creates cascading failure rather than localized damage." Romy had begun transferring data within seconds. The preparation consumed 3 days, which was 3 days the Commonwealth could not easily spare, and the Yamato could afford even less. Okita spent most of those days on the Andromeda's bridge, or in Romy's Tactical Analysis Center, working through the world ship data with Kodai and Dylan in sessions that ran long past any reasonable rest cycle. Dylan watched the captain move through those sessions and revise his understanding of Juzo Okita several times. Upward, each time, and with increasing respect for what the man was managing simultaneously. The illness was not retreating. It was, if anything, advancing with the particular indifference of a biological process that did not share its host's commitment to completing the mission first. Okita gave it nothing. Not attention, not acknowledgement, not the slightest behavioral accommodation beyond the occasional moment when he would pause and hold very still for a few seconds before continuing as though nothing had interrupted him. Kodai watched these moments with eyes that understood exactly what they meant and a face that maintained the expression his captain required him to maintain. Focused, operational, present. On the second day, Charlemagne Bolivar made his move. It was not the aggressive move Dylan had anticipated and prepared contingencies for. It was more elegant than that, and therefore more dangerous. The Nietzschean Pride Alpha requested a private meeting with Kodai, not Okita, not Dylan, but Kodai specifically, and the request arrived through back channels that suggested Charlemagne had spent the previous 48 hours doing exactly what Nietzscheans did best, which was intelligence gathering disguised as inaction. Kodai brought the request to Okita, who considered it briefly and said, "Go. Listen to what he offers. Tell me everything." The meeting lasted an hour. Charlemagne was direct in the way that people are direct when they have decided that directness is the most efficient path to the outcome they want. He laid his intelligence on the table without theater. The Eternal Supremacy's long-range sensors had been tracking the world ship's approach vector with the obsessive attention that Nietzschean's survival instinct demanded. And what those sensors had revealed in the past 12 hours was information that Charlemagne had decided was worth trading for something specific. The world ship was not following a standard approach vector toward the Commonwealth capital. It had altered course 18 hours ago. It was heading directly for the Yamato's position. Kodai absorbed this without visible reaction, which was its own kind of reaction, and asked one question. "Why are you telling me this instead of Captain Hunt?" Charlemagne looked at him with the assessment of a man who has studied his subject carefully. "Won't, because Hunt will respond to this information with heroics and a speech about Commonwealth values. You will respond to it with tactics." He paused. "Your captain is dying, Kodai. You know it. The wave motion gun requires his authorization to fire. I've been watching your command protocols. When he can no longer give that authorization, the question of who commands the Yamato becomes the most strategically significant question in this universe." Another pause, calibrated to land precisely. "I am offering the Bolivar Pride's full military support, every ship, every fighter, every resource, in exchange for a simple understanding. When the time comes, you make the decision your captain cannot." Kodai stood up from the table. "My captain," he said with a quietness that carried the full weight of everything the Yamato had already survived, "Ish will give that authorization himself. Count on it." He left without waiting for a response and walked back through the Andromeda's corridors toward the tactical center, where Okita was still working. And the expression on his face was the expression of a young man who has just been shown a door he refuses to open and understands, with complete clarity, exactly why it was placed in his path. The Magog world ship arrived at the edge of optimal engagement range on the morning of the 14th day. And it was worse than the numbers had suggested. Numbers were abstractions. They described mass and velocity and weapons yield with the clean precision of mathematics that did not bleed or grieve or understand the difference between a star system and the civilizations that had spent centuries building themselves around it. The world ship in Romy's tactical display was a number, an enormous, staggering, nearly incomprehensible number, but a number nonetheless. The world ship through the Andromeda Ascendant's forward viewport was something else entirely. It was the physical expression of a philosophy, the philosophy that hope was a temporary condition, that everything built would eventually be consumed, that the universe's natural state was the silence that preceded the first light and would follow the last. It moved through space the way a certainty moves, without urgency, without doubt, with the absolute confidence of something that has never seriously encountered a reason to stop. 14 worlds lay in its direct approach path. Dylan Hunt had spent the previous 72 hours doing what he did, working every channel, calling every favor, assembling every Commonwealth vessel that could reach the engagement zone in time. The fleet that had gathered around the Andromeda Ascendant was the largest single Commonwealth military formation since before the fall, and it was, by every honest calculation Romy could produce, insufficient, not inadequate. Insufficient, a meaningful distinction in the mathematics of survival. The fleet would hurt the world ship. It would cost the abyss something measurable and real. It would not stop it. The Yamato held position at the center of the formation. Okita stood at his command station and looked at the world ship through the forward viewport with the same expression he had brought to every impossible thing the universe had placed in front of him. The expression of a man who has already accepted the reality of what he is seeing and is now entirely focused on what to do about it. The wave motion engine was running at full power. The wave motion gun was charged to 100% for the first time since the Yamato had crossed the dimensional boundary into this universe. The charge had taken 11 hours. And during those 11 hours, the energy building in the weapon's core had made itself felt throughout the ship in ways that went beyond the purely physical, a resonance that the crew experienced as something between sound and light, and the particular feeling of standing at the edge of something vast and being aware, completely aware, of exactly where you are. Analyzer had monitored the charge cycle with continuous readings and had, at the 98% mark, gone briefly silent in a way that suggested even a machine could recognize when it was present at something that exceeded its categories. Kodai stood at tactical and said nothing. He had said what needed to be said to Okita the previous evening. Not about Charlemagne's offer, which he had reported in full, and which Okita had received with the unsurprised nod of a man who had already anticipated it, but about the thing beneath the offer, about Earth, about the mission, about the fact that what they were preparing to do with the wave motion gun in this universe would reduce their energy reserves to a level that made the return journey and the completion of their original mission a mathematical question rather than a certainty. Okita had listened to all of it and then said very quietly, "Kodai, what do you believe the Yamato is?" Kodai had considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "A warship," he had said finally, "built to protect what matters." "Yes," Okita had said, "built to protect what matters, not what matters to Earth specifically, not what matters to the Earth Defense Forces. What matters?" He had looked at his tactical officer with the eyes of a man passing something across a distance that was not measured in years. 8 billion people are dying at home. Billions more are threatened here. The mathematics of conscience does not permit us to weigh one against the other on the basis of which ones happen to share our atmosphere. Kodai had not answered because there was nothing to answer. He had simply nodded, and the nod had contained everything. The battle began at 0600 Commonwealth Standard Time with the world ship launching its first wave of Magog swarmcraft, hundreds of thousands of them, a tide that made the previous assault look like a preliminary gesture. The Commonwealth fleet met them at the outer engagement perimeter with everything available. And the space between the formations became a continuous theater of destruction that Romy logged with the comprehensive attention of an AI that understood that what happened here would be recorded in every history that survived it. Dylan fought the Andromeda with the controlled ferocity of a man who had been building toward this moment for a decade. Not with rage, which was Charlemagne Bolivar's instrument, but with the particular intensity of someone who has decided that this is the hill, this is the moment, this is the place where the line is drawn and held, regardless of cost. The eternal supremacy fought alongside with the brutal efficiency that Nietzschean culture had refined across centuries of survival, and even Charlemagne Bolivar, in the privacy of his own command center. He experienced something that his genetic philosophy had no comfortable category for, something that was not hope exactly, but was what hope looked like from the perspective of a worldview that had always considered hope a weakness. The world ship's primary weapons began targeting the Commonwealth fleet's center mass at 0743. Three vessels were destroyed in the first salvo, two more in the second. The formation held because Dylan Hunt ordered it to hold, and because the people in those ships had chosen, each of them individually and collectively, to be the generation that did not break. The generation that looked at 3 centuries of collapse and decided that the collapsing stopped here. At 0801, Okita opened the command channel. "Captain Hunt," he said, with the quietness that was his version of ceremony, "touch us, we are in position." Dylan's response came back immediately, and beneath the tactical precision of it was something that was not a Commonwealth captain speaking to an Allied commander, but one human being speaking to another across the full impossible distance of everything that separated them. Universe and language and the particular loneliness of people who carry too much for too long. "Captain Okita, the corridor is yours." Okita looked at Kodai. Kodai looked at the targeting solution, the precise intersection of the world ship's structural architecture that 3 days of Romy's analysis had identified as the point where the wave motion gun's discharge would propagate through the construct's internal systems in cascading failure rather than contained damage. The shot was extraordinarily difficult. And the margin for error was measured in fractions of a degree across a targeting distance that pushed the weapon's effective accuracy to its absolute limit. It was, Kodai thought, exactly the kind of shot that the Yamato had always been asked to make. "Solution is locked," he said. Okita placed his hand on the authorization control with the deliberateness of a man who understands that some actions, once taken, cannot be untaken, and who takes them anyway because not taking them is its own kind of action with its own kind of consequences. "For Earth," he said quietly, and the two words carried everything. The dying planet and the 8 billion people and the mission and the impossible distance and the crew of 1,000 who had crossed the space between stars and then the space between universes and were still here, still fighting, and are still refusing to accept that hope was a temporary condition. He pressed the authorization. The wave motion gun fired at 100% charge for the first time in the history of either universe, and what it did to the space between the Yamato and the Magog world ship was something that Romy would spend the next several months attempting to describe in language that adequately conveyed both the physics and the magnitude, and would ultimately conclude that certain events exceed the capacity of description and must simply be recorded as having occurred. The beam reached the world ship's structural nexus point at the precise angle Kodai's solution had calculated. The cascading failure began. It moved through the world ship's internal systems the way a fracture moves through ancient ice, inevitable once begun. Following the lines of structural weakness, with the patient thoroughness of physics pursuing its own logic. The construct that had taken the abyss centuries to build and had crossed 3 galaxies, consuming everything in its path, began, compartment by compartment, system by system, to come apart. It took 47 minutes. During those 47 minutes, the Commonwealth fleet held its position, and the Yamato sat at the center of the formation, with its wave motion engine running on reserve power, and its crew standing at their stations in the silence of people who have done the thing and are now watching the thing be done, and understanding, fully and without mitigation, what it cost. When the world ship's final structural integrity failed, and the construct collapsed inward in a cascade of released energy that briefly outshone the nearest star, the spirit of the abyss experienced something it had not experienced in eons. It experienced the silence it had always intended for others. The silence after the world ship's collapse lasted longer than silences usually did in the aftermath of battles. Normally, the communications channels filled immediately. Damage reports, casualty assessments, the urgent administrative machinery of survival reasserting itself over the fact of having survived. This silence was different. It had the quality of something that needed to be held for a moment before it was filled, the way certain kinds of grief need to be acknowledged before they can be set aside and worked around. Every ship in the Commonwealth formation observed it, and nobody needed to be told why. On the Andromeda Ascendance Bridge, Dylan Hunt sat in his command chair and looked at the place where the world ship had been, which was now a region of space that glowed with dissipating energy in colors that had no names in the Commonwealth's optical taxonomy and did not speak for 90 seconds. Becca Valentine was at her station, with her hands folded and her eyes forward, and the expression of a woman who had grown up in the hard margins of a collapsed civilization and had spent her adult life in the company of a man who refused to accept that collapse as final, and who was now sitting with the knowledge that his refusal had, against all reasonable probability, been vindicated in the most comprehensive possible way. Romy stood against the far wall with her arms at her sides and her eyes closed, which was what she did when she was processing something that required her full cognitive resources. Not the tactical data, which she had already logged and filed and begun analyzing, but the other thing, the thing that happened when you had been present at a moment that changed the shape of the future and needed to understand what that shape now was. Transgemini was smiling. It was not a large smile. It was the smile of someone who has watched a very long and very difficult thing finally resolve the way it needed to resolve, and who is allowing themselves one moment of acknowledgement before returning to the ongoing complexity of existence. She looked at the glowing space where the world ship had been, and then looked away, iron because her relationship with completed events was different from everyone else's, and dwelling on them was not her habit. Dylan finally spoke. Damage report. Romy opened her eyes. 17 Commonwealth vessels destroyed. 43 damaged to varying degrees. Casualties are still being assessed. A pause. The Eternal Supremacy lost its entire port fighter complement and has significant hull damage, but remains operational. Charlemagne Bolivar is alive. Another pause, fractionally longer. The Yamato is structurally intact. Wave motion engine is running on reserve power. Approximately 12% of normal operational capacity. Their weapon systems are offline pending recharge. Life signs aboard are all present and stable. She looked at Dylan directly. One, Captain Okita is in his medical bay. Dylan was already reaching for the communication panel. The medical bay of the Yamato was smaller than anything the Commonwealth would have designated for a vessel of that size, and it was arranged with the functional economy of a ship that had been built for a specific mission rather than long-term habitation. Dr. Sato moved through it with the practiced efficiency of a physician who had been managing impossible situations in inadequate facilities for long enough that the inadequacy had become simply the baseline condition of his work. Okita was sitting up when Dylan came through the hatch, which was either genuine improvement or the captain's will overriding his body's honest assessment of the situation. Probably, Dylan thought, the latter. Kodai stood at the bulkhead with his arms folded and the expression of a young man maintaining the face his captain needed to see while processing, somewhere behind it, everything the past 14 days had cost. Captain Hunt, Okita said, and his voice was quieter than it had been but carried the same quality it always carried. The quality of a man who had not surrendered the thing at his center, regardless of what the periphery had given up. Dylan pulled a chair to the bedside and sat in it without ceremony. Captain Okita, how are you? I have been better, Okita said, with the first thing that had been humor in any of their exchanges. Dry, precise, entirely controlled. I have also been worse, Dylan nodded. The world ship is gone. The Abyss lost its primary instrument, and our analysts believe the corruption network it had spent 3 centuries building will begin to fracture without the world ship as its focal point. It won't disappear overnight. It won't disappear in a year. But the Commonwealth has time now. Real time. Not the borrowed time we've been operating on. He paused. That's because of you. Because of the Yamato and her crew. Okita received this without false modesty and without visible satisfaction. simply as the accounting of a thing that had been done. Earth still needs what we came to find, he said. The mission is not complete. I know, Dylan said, and we're going to get you home. He leaned forward slightly. Romy has been working on the slipstream data from your arrival event for the past 3 days. The convulsion that brought you here left a resonance signature in the local slipstream architecture, a kind of echo of the dimensional boundary breach. She believes she can use that signature as a navigational reference point to construct a return aperture. It will require precise timing and more power than a standard slipstream transit. But your wave motion engine, even at reserve capacity, generates enough exotic energy to force the aperture open. He met Okita's eyes. She gives it an 83% probability of success. 83%, Kodai said from the bulkhead, and the relief in his voice was the relief of a navigator who has been without a course for 2 weeks and has just been handed one. Okita was quiet for a moment. Aero-ray and the other 17%? The aperture collapses during transit, Romy said through the medical-based communication system, because she had been monitoring the exchange and had decided that directness was what the situation required. The Yamato would be lost in the dimensional boundary between universes. I want to be transparent about that risk. Okita nodded with the nod of a man who has spent his entire career making decisions in the 17%. When can we attempt the transit? The wave motion engine will need 48 hours to reach the minimum power threshold for the aperture. The resonance signature in the slipstream will remain viable for approximately 72 hours from now before it degrades beyond usable parameters. Dylan paused. You have a window. Then we will use it, Okita said simply. The 48 hours that followed had the particular quality of time spent in the knowledge that it is finite, and therefore more valuable than ordinary time. The Commonwealth crews worked alongside the Yamato's crew in the repair operations with the shared efficiency of people who have fought beside each other and discovered that the language of work crosses barriers that spoken language cannot always bridge. Romy coordinated with Analyzer, with the focused mutual respect of 2 AI systems discovering that their approaches to intelligence were different enough to be complementary. Baker Valentine taught Shima 3 Commonwealth navigational techniques that he absorbed with the intensity of a helmsman who understands that knowledge is always worth carrying regardless of whether you know yet where you will need it. Charlemagne Bolivar came aboard the Yamato on the final evening, unannounced and without his usual political architecture. No aids, no strategic framing, no offer embedded in courtesy. He came to Kodai's station on the bridge and stood there for a moment in the silence of a man who has been recalibrating something fundamental about his understanding of the universe. I told you your captain would be unable to give the authorization himself, he said. You did, Kodai said. I was wrong. Kodai looked at him for a moment. Yes. Charlemagne nodded once, with the fractional adjustment of a man updating a model. He left without further elaboration, which was, Kodai thought, the most honest thing the Nietzschean had done since they had met. At 0400 on the 49th hour, the Yamato moved to the transit coordinates Romy had calculated. Sona and the Commonwealth fleet formed a loose perimeter around it in the way that people stand around something they want to witness and honor simultaneously. Dylan Hunt watched from the Andromeda's forward viewport with Trance at his left and Bika at his right, and the feeling he had carried through a decade of rebuilding. The feeling that the universe, despite everything, despite the abyss and the collapse and the 300 years of silence, was capable of producing moments that justified the work. Okita's voice came through the open channel one final time. It was addressed to Dylan, but it carried in its quietness the quality of something meant for more than one person. Captain Hunt, what you are rebuilding here is worth the cost of rebuilding it. Do not allow anyone, including yourself, to tell you otherwise. A pause. Why Earth will remember that in its darkest hour, the Commonwealth's captain did not look away. Dylan found that he did not immediately have words, which was unusual for him, and so he offered the truest thing available. Captain Okita, safe journey. Finish your mission. The wave motion engine surged to the power threshold Romy had calculated, and the dimensional aperture opened in the space before the Yamato's bow like a wound in the fabric between realities. Ragged at the edges and burning with the same impossible colors the wave motion gun had painted across the sky 14 days ago. The iron ship moved toward it with the deliberate purpose that had defined every kilometer of its journey, carrying its crew and its mission and the weight of 8 billion people counting the days. It crossed the threshold. The aperture closed behind it like water closing over a stone, and the space where the Yamato had been was ordinary space again, unmarked and silent, giving no indication that something extraordinary had passed through it. Dylan Hunt looked at the empty coordinates for a long time. "Do you think they made it?" Bika asked. Trance answered before Dylan could, with the certainty of someone speaking from knowledge rather than hope. "They made it," she said. "They were always going to make it." She paused, and the ancient golden eyes held something that was not quite sorrow and not quite joy, but lived in the precise territory between them, where the most important things tend to reside. "That was never the question." "What was the question?" Dylan asked. Trance looked at him with the look she reserved for truths that were simple enough to say plainly. "Whether the universe still produces people willing to carry hope across the impossible distance." She looked back at the empty coordinates. "Now we know." Dylan turned from the viewport, and the Commonwealth fleet turned with him, and in the deep dark between the galaxies, the dissipating light of the Magog world ship's destruction continued to fade toward the ordinary dark, and the work of building something worth protecting continued as it always had, one impossible day at a time. In the weeks that followed the Battle of the World Ship, the system's Commonwealth began the slow and necessary work of understanding what had happened to it. Not merely the tactical event, honor the destruction of the Abyss's primary instrument and the fracturing of its corruption network, but the deeper thing, the thing that Trance had named and that Dylan Hunt turned over in his mind during the quiet hours, that a rebuilt civilization occasionally permitted its architects. A ship from another universe, crewed by mortal humans on a mission of desperate hope, had crossed the impossible distance and changed the shape of the future. Not because it was the most powerful vessel available, not because its weapon was the largest or its crew the most sophisticated, but because Captain Juzo Okita had looked at a universe that was not his own, at billions of people who shared no citizenship with his dying Earth, and had decided that conscience did not recognize dimensional boundaries. Order the Commonwealth recorded the Yamato in its historical archives under a category that had not previously existed: vessels from beyond the known multiverse. And the entry was brief because the facts were brief, but the significance attached to those facts was not brief at all. Dylan Hunt wrote the entry himself, in the plain direct language he preferred for things that mattered, and the final line read, "They came from a dying world to save a living one, and then went home to finish what they started." Whether they completed their mission, whether Earth survived, whether Captain Okita lived to see the planet he had given everything to protect return to the green and blue world it had once been, these things the Commonwealth could not know. The dimensional boundary between universes did not permit correspondence or confirmation. The Yamato had passed through it and was gone, carrying its answers with it into a reality the Commonwealth could not reach. But Trance Gemini, when asked, smiled in the way she smiled when the answer was yes. And in the Commonwealth, for the generation that had stood at the edge of the final silence and watched an iron ship from another universe fire its impossible weapon into the darkness, that was enough.